I opened the invitation just 2 weeks before the wedding, my name spelled wrong as if I were a stranger. The sting was sharp, but I steadied myself. I'd spent a lifetime learning when to stand tall. I booked my own ticket, packed the heirloom veil, and decided to arrive with more than they expected. What they didn't know was that this trip wasn't about witnessing vows, it was about delivering my own. Before I continue the story, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from. The late afternoon sun poured through my kitchen window, casting golden streaks across the worn oak table where I sat sorting through the day's mail. Out here on the coast, spring had a way of sneaking in. The air softer, the gulls louder, the salt smell heavier. I lived alone now, in the same Charleston house I'd shared with my husband before he passed. My daughter Emily had been polite enough over the years, but the distance between us was measured not in miles but in the small slights that had slowly stacked up over time. I thumbed through the usual stack: utility bill, grocery flyer, a catalog for patio furniture I didn't need, until my fingers landed on a thick, cream-colored envelope. It didn't have the flourish of handwriting or the warmth of a personal note. Instead, my name was printed in a plain font, the kind you get from a discount stationery shop, and even then they'd managed to misspell Harrington by dropping the second R. The postmark said it all, mailed just 2 weeks before her wedding date. I sat back in my chair, the envelope heavy in my hand. My first instinct was to shrug it off, tell myself maybe they'd been busy. But I've lived long enough to know that people rarely miss details unless they want to. And Emily? Well, she was precise when she wanted to be. I slid my finger under the flap, pulling out a glossy invitation that seemed more like a formality than a heartfelt request to be part of her day. I thought back to Thanksgiving 2 years ago, when I'd driven up to Charlotte with a pecan pie still warm from my oven. She'd greeted me with a polite smile, accepted the pie, and then spent the rest of the afternoon chatting in corners with her fiancé's family. Our conversations, when they happened, were clipped, like someone cutting string too short to tie a knot. The last time we'd seen each other in person, at my cousin Helen's funeral, she'd given me a quick pat on the arm instead of a hug. That moment had stayed with me. Maya Angelou's words came to mind. When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. I'd ignored too many first times with Emily, convincing myself it was just stress, just life getting in the way. But now, sitting there with a late invitation and my name misspelled, I felt the question creep in. Was this wedding trip going to be another exercise in swallowing my pride? I suspected her fiancé's family, all old Charlotte money and cool smiles, had something to do with the growing chill. I picked up the phone, dialing Emily's number before I could talk myself out of it. She answered on the second ring, her voice brisk. "Hi, Mom. Everything okay?" "I got the invitation," I said. "I was just wondering about the travel arrangements." There was a pause, the faint sound of someone moving dishes in the background. "Oh, we figured you'd just book your own flight." The way she said it, light, almost breezy, landed heavier than any argument could. No offer to coordinate, no mention of a reserved seat with other family members, just the expectation that I'd make my own way there. "I see," I replied, keeping my voice even. "Any particular time you'd like me to arrive?" "Just be here the night before," she said, already sounding distracted. "We've got the rehearsal dinner then." It wasn't the $400 that stung. I could afford the ticket without blinking. It was the message, about who was worth a seat, about who was part of the inner circle and who wasn't. Still, I decided I'd be there. If they were trying to make me feel like an afterthought, I'd make my presence impossible to ignore. I went upstairs to the cedar chest at the foot of my bed and pulled out the garment bag that had been there for decades. Inside was the veil I'd worn on my own wedding day. Fine lace restored with my own hands, every bead re-sewn in place over the years. I'd always imagined passing it down to Emily. Alongside it, I wrapped up a small velvet box containing my mother's pearl earrings and a hand-stitched quilt I'd worked on through last winter's long nights. I packed them carefully, each item wrapped in tissue, and made sure they would fit into my carry-on. I wasn't about to trust them to airline luggage handlers. As I zipped the bag shut, I caught my reflection in the mirror. Silver hair pinned back neatly, lines on my face telling their own quiet story. If they're going to sideline me, I said out loud to no one in particular, I'll make sure I'm still the person they remember in every photo. The airport was bustling when I arrived on the morning of my flight. Families in matching t-shirts and bright sneakers clustered near the gates, chattering about their vacations. I walked alone, my veil bag slung over one shoulder, my carry-on in hand. The smell of coffee and cinnamon rolls hung in the air, mingling with the occasional announcement over the intercom. At the gate, a woman about my age nodded toward the garment bag. "Someone getting married?" she asked with a kind smile. "My daughter," I replied, returning the smile, but leaving it at that. I wasn't about to unpack the full story for a stranger in an airport terminal. As boarding began, I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and stepped forward. This trip wasn't just about attending a wedding. It was about taking stock. If the undercurrent of exclusion I'd been feeling turned into something more overt, I would be ready. When the plane touched down, I turned on my phone, waiting for the usual flood of messages and flight updates. But one text caught my eye. From an unknown number. They weren't expecting you to actually come. I stared at the words, the hum of passengers unbuckling their seatbelts fading into the background. That text wasn't a mistake. It was a warning, or maybe a challenge. Either way, it told me everything I needed to know about the days ahead. The plane touched down with a soft bump, the kind you hardly notice unless you're already tense. I glanced out the oval window, taking in the familiar landscape of Charleston. Spring sunlight stretched in long, lazy beams across the tarmac, and a thin haze of humidity clung to the air like a warm scarf. I tightened my grip on the garment bag containing the veil and shifted the weight of my carry-on where the carefully wrapped gifts rested. Stepping off the plane, I kept my pace measured. My eyes scanned the crowd at the gate, then the line of people waiting beyond the security ropes. I looked for her, my daughter, or at least a friendly face from her fiancé's family. There was no one. No wave, no quick smile, not even an awkward glance in my direction. I took out my phone. The screen was blank. No missed calls, no new messages, no, "We're running late, Mom." Just nothing. I let my thumb hover over her contact for a moment, then slid the phone back into my bag. Standing there would only make me look like someone waiting for rescue, and I had no intention of playing that role. Instead, I headed toward the taxi stand. The Charleston air hit me as soon as the sliding doors opened, sweet with magnolia, salty from the harbor, and heavy enough to press against my skin. When people expect you to be rattled, I reminded myself, calm is your sharpest weapon. The cab ride was quiet except for the driver's low hum to some old country tune on the radio. I kept my gaze fixed out the window, watching the streets grow greener and more manicured as we moved deeper into the suburbs. When the taxi finally turned into her street, the first thing I noticed was the lawn. Years ago, I had helped her plant rose bushes along the walkway, deep red ones that would bloom just in time for spring weddings. Now they were overgrown, their petals scattered across the ground as though no one had bothered to tend to them. A sleek, unfamiliar car sat in the driveway, black, polished, and cold-looking, the kind of vehicle her fiancé would choose over the weathered blue sedan she once drove. Even the house seemed altered. It was still the same structure, but the warmth was gone, replaced by sharp lines and minimalist decor visible through the front windows. No colorful wreath, no potted plants. The welcome mat I'd chosen for her as a housewarming gift had been replaced with a generic "Home Sweet Home" sign, the kind you buy in bulk. I paid the driver, stepped out, and adjusted the garment bag over my arm. The sun was high, but the breeze had a bite, stirring the edges of my jacket. I climbed the steps and knocked. The door swung open to reveal a woman I didn't recognize right away, tall with a sleek ponytail and a cool expression. "Oh, you're here," she said, her tone hovering between surprise and indifference. "I am," I replied evenly. She stepped aside and called over her shoulder. "Lauren, your mom's here." Footsteps approached, and my daughter appeared. She was dressed casually, but her smile was the kind people wear when they've just been interrupted. She hugged me with one arm, the kind of hug you give to a distant neighbor. "That was a long trip," she said, glancing at the garment bag but making no move to take it. "It was," I agreed, holding her gaze just long enough for her to look away. Inside, the living room was filled with people. Some I recognized, others I didn't. Conversations slowed as I stepped in, then picked up again in quieter tones. I caught the tail end of a sentence from an older man before he noticed me and turned his head. On the kitchen counter, a seating chart lay spread out, handwritten in neat script. My eyes flicked to it, and before I could stop myself, I found my name. It was there, far from the main family table, a corner spot, nearly against the wall. I wasn't supposed to see it. The way my daughter quickly shifted the chart told me that much. I didn't say a word. Words at that moment would have been a gift I wasn't ready to give. Instead, I tucked the detail away, another bead on the string I was slowly threading. Lauren led me down the hall to a small guest room. The bed was made, but in that hasty, guest last-minute kind of way. One pillow, flattened from use, no fresh flowers, no small note of welcome. The curtains hung crookedly, letting in a thin slice of afternoon sun that fell directly across the suitcase stand. "I hope this works for you," she said. "It will," I answered, my tone neutral. When she left, I unzipped my carry-on and placed the gifts at the bottom of the small closet, setting the veil on top. Then I locked the suitcase. My late mother's voice came to me, as it often did when I found myself in rooms like this. Hospitality isn't about space, it's about heart. This room had 4 walls and a bed, but none of the latter. I sat for a moment on the edge of the bed, letting the quiet fill my ears until I could hear the faint sounds from the living room. Laughter, the clink of glasses, the low hum of conversation. Then a pause. And in that pause, my name, spoken in a tone that carried more mockery than affection. The laughter that followed was muffled, but it didn't need to be loud for me to understand exactly where I stood. That laugh from the night before lingered in my head like a faint ringing in the ears you can't quite shake. I woke up to the muted clatter of dishes and muffled conversation drifting down the hall. A faint aroma of coffee wafted under the door, rich and familiar, but no one had thought to knock or offer me a cup. I sat up slowly, the springs in the mattress groaning beneath me. The guest room was dim, just a narrow slice of morning sunlight cutting across the wall. My suitcase sat in the corner, and I found myself pulling it toward me without thinking. When I unzipped it, the first thing my eyes landed on was the veil. It rested neatly inside, still wrapped in tissue paper. I lifted it carefully, feeling the texture under my fingertips. Every stitch was one I had placed myself, hunched over a sewing table with a desk lamp throwing light onto the lace. My mind wandered to the moment I'd first shown it to my daughter, months ago. She'd gasped and said, "Mom, this will be the heart of the day." I stared at it now, hearing that sentence play back in my mind, only now it sounded hollow. There's a saying I've always liked. A promise is a cloud. Fulfillment is rain. The cloud had been beautiful. I was still waiting for the rain. I decided then I wouldn't react rashly. Today I would watch, listen, and read between the lines. People reveal themselves if you give them the space to do it. Months earlier, the world had felt different. I could still see myself in my kitchen, cordless phone cradled between my shoulder and ear, a notebook open in front of me. My daughter's voice was bright, almost breathless. "I want a wedding that feels like family, Mom," she'd said. "Not stuffy, not just for show. I want warmth, people laughing, everyone together." We'd spent nearly 2 hours on the phone that night. She'd described cream and sage green for the colors, a live band instead of a DJ, and a ceremony under the old oak tree at the back of her fiancé's parents' property. She'd asked if I could bring the veil, saying she couldn't imagine wearing anything else. I remember the flutter in my chest as I hung up. For the first time in years, I'd felt like she wanted me close again. I'd even gone to the trouble of setting aside part of my savings to make the trip without worry, and to buy the kinds of gifts that mean something, not just from a registry, but from the heart. Back then, there was no hesitation in my mind. I was wanted, needed even. But sitting here now, that memory had a bitter aftertaste. The more I replayed it, the more it seemed like her warmth might have been about securing the things I could bring, not the person I was. I finally left the room, the veil tucked safely away again. The kitchen smelled like toasted bread and coffee grounds. Around the table sat my daughter, her fiancé, and his sister. They were leaning in toward one another, talking about something I couldn't quite catch. "Morning," I said, stepping in. 3 pairs of eyes glanced up at me, then back to their plates. The fiancé muttered, "Morning," without lifting his gaze. My daughter gestured toward the counter. "There's toast if you want." No offer of coffee. No chair pulled out. I took a slice of toast and sat at the far end of the table. They carried on, mentioning people I didn't know and events I hadn't been told about, some pre-wedding get-together from the night before, apparently. I tried once to join in, commenting on how nice the weather was for an outdoor ceremony. Her fiancé smiled thinly and changed the subject to his golf game. I noticed the little things, the way their shoulders stayed angled toward each other, the fleeting glances exchanged like they were sharing an inside joke. I finished the toast slowly, keeping my face neutral. Back in my room, I thought about how far this had drifted from what I'd expected. In the past 6 months, the signs had been there if I'd been willing to see them. The phone calls had grown shorter. Texts had gone from paragraphs to a few clipped words. When she'd sent photos of the dress, she'd forgotten to include me in the group chat with the bridal party. I remembered the sting of finding out about the engagement party only through a distant cousin's Facebook post. These weren't isolated oversights, they were part of a steady retreat. It wasn't sudden, I realized. This frost had been creeping in for a while. Distance isn't always measured in miles, I thought. If this pattern kept up through the weekend, I'd have to think about my next step. I didn't know what that would be yet, but I knew myself well enough to trust I'd find it. Later that morning, I went back to the kitchen to clear my plate. The others had left, probably to run errands for the wedding. As I stacked the dish in the sink, I heard a voice from the next room. It was the fiancé, low but clear enough to catch. "Don't worry, after this weekend, she won't be an issue." I froze, fingers tightening around the plate. The edges bit into my skin as my heart began to thud. He didn't say my name, but the she felt like it could only mean one person. I stayed perfectly still, straining to catch more, but his tone dropped lower. A moment later, I heard the front door open and close. I stood there, plate still in my hands, the words echoing in my mind. They planted themselves deep, like seeds dropped in dark soil. And I had the sinking feeling they'd sprout sooner than I wanted. That laugh from the night before had followed me into my dreams, bending and twisting into something that left a sour taste in my mouth. When I finally opened my eyes, the guest room felt unfamiliar. Too quiet except for the faint shuffle of footsteps and the clink of dishes from somewhere down the hall. The scent of coffee drifted through the door. Strong, freshly brewed, but no one had thought to bring me a cup or even tap on the door to say good morning. I sat up, the mattress groaning beneath me, and rubbed the sleep from my eyes. My suitcase sat by the wall, half open from last night. Without thinking, I reached for it and carefully pulled out the bundle of tissue paper tucked inside. The veil lay there, soft under my fingertips, the delicate lace catching on my skin. Every stitch was mine, sewn late at night under the dim light of my desk lamp, glasses sliding down my nose. Holding it now brought back a rush of warmth and ache all at once. I could still hear my daughter's voice from months ago, full of certainty, full of promise, telling me this veil would be the heart of the day. I swallowed, forcing away the lump in my throat, and repeated an old saying I'd always loved. A promise is a cloud, fulfillment is rain. The cloud had been beautiful. I was still waiting for the rain, and today I decided I'd be watching, listening, reading between the lines instead of reacting. If there was truth to be found, it would come out in the small spaces between words. Months earlier, I had been standing at my kitchen counter with the cordless phone pressed between my ear and shoulder, a notepad open in front of me. My daughter's voice had come through bright, almost breathless. "I want a wedding that feels like family, Mom," she'd said. "Not formal. I want warmth, laughter, people feeling like they belong." We talked for nearly 2 hours that night. She told me about her vision: cream and sage green for the colors, a live band under the oak tree in her fiancé's parents' backyard, twinkle lights strung from branch to branch, and the veil. Always the veil. "Mom, I want it to be the heart of the day. I want everyone to know it's from you." At the time, her words had wrapped around me like a blanket. I'd hung up the phone with a kind of buoyancy I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just about the wedding, it was about being wanted again, being needed. I'd gone through my savings, planning not just for the flight, but for gifts, and not the kind you pick off a registry. I wanted mine to be the kind of presents people keep for a lifetime. But sitting in that guest room now, the warmth of those calls felt like something else. Like the glow of a fireplace you realize is just a screensaver. I couldn't shake the thought that maybe all that enthusiasm had been about securing what I could bring, not about me at all. When I finally walked into the kitchen, the late morning light was spilling across the counter. My daughter, her fiancé, and his sister sat around the table, talking over plates of toast and scrambled eggs. None of them moved when I stepped in. "Morning," I offered, keeping my tone light. Her fiancé glanced up briefly. "Morning." "There's toast if you want," my daughter said, nodding toward the counter without meeting my eyes. I took a slice and sat down at the far end of the table. The conversation kept rolling, easy and bright, but I couldn't follow it. They were talking about people I didn't know, about some gathering last night I hadn't even heard about. I tried to contribute, commenting on how lucky they were to have such perfect weather for the ceremony. Her fiancé gave me a tight smile and pivoted the topic to his golf game. No one asked me another question. I noticed their shoulders turned toward each other, the occasional flicker of a glance that seemed to pass some silent message between them. I kept my hands folded in my lap, forcing my face into something pleasant. Back in my room, I found myself sifting through the last 6 months in my mind. The phone calls had gotten shorter. Text messages were no longer whole sentences, just clipped responses. The time she sent photos of the dress, I wasn't included in the group chat with her bridesmaids. "Oh, I forgot to add you," she'd said, like it was nothing. The engagement party. I found out through a cousin's Facebook post. None of these were big, dramatic betrayals. They were quieter, but they added up, like frost creeping in overnight. This didn't start here, I thought. It had been building. Distance isn't always measured in miles. If the weekend kept going this way, I would need to think about what came next. I didn't have the answer yet, but I knew myself. I'd find one. By late morning, the others had gone, probably to run errands for the wedding. I returned to the kitchen to clear my plate from breakfast. The house felt emptier without their voices. That's when I heard him, the fiancé. His voice came from the next room, low but clear enough to catch. "Don't worry," he said into the phone. "After this weekend, she won't be an issue." I froze, the plate still in my hands. The edge dug into my skin, but I didn't move. He didn't say my name, but who else could she mean? I strained to hear more, but his voice dropped. A moment later, the front door opened and closed. I stood there, staring at the sink, the words echoing inside me. They planted themselves deep, like seeds in dark soil. And I had the sinking feeling they were already starting to grow. By the time I reached the rehearsal venue, the late spring air in Charleston had settled into that soft, honey-colored light that photographers adore. The scent of fresh blooms hung heavy in the courtyard. Roses, peonies, and something faintly citrusy I couldn't quite place. Staff moved briskly from one end of the open-air space to the other, adjusting floral arrangements, testing the sound system, and rolling out chairs in perfectly straight rows. Near the entrance, a large easel displayed the schedule for the afternoon. My eyes traveled down the neatly typed list. Bridegroom arrival, family portraits, bridal party practice, parent introductions. I looked twice, scanning the columns. My name wasn't there. Neither in the parent section, nor anywhere else. Before I could dwell on it, my daughter appeared at the far end of the walkway, laughing with a photographer who was showing her something on a camera screen. She spotted me and offered a quick hug, her eyes darting past me toward the coordinator waiting with a clipboard. "Hi, Mom. We're just figuring out the shot list," she said, her words clipped. "I'll catch up in a sec, okay?" Then she was gone, swept into a whirl of directions and poses. From the corner of my eye, I saw the fiancé's parents being greeted warmly by the staff. A young woman in black slacks and a headset guided them to front row seats, offering drinks. No one approached me. Instead, I found myself on the outer edge of the space, close enough to see everything, yet far enough to feel the invisible line between involved and present. I stayed put, watching, memorizing. Behind the stage, stacked neatly beside a crate of extra candles and folded linens, sat a white cardboard box. Even from a distance, I knew what it was. The veil. My veil. The one I'd brought from home in its own padded garment bag. I moved closer and bent to read the label. Prop. Stage left. Prop. Not veil. Not bridal accessory. The coordinator glanced up from adjusting the aisle runner. "Excuse me," I said quietly, nodding toward the box. "Why is that labeled as a prop?" She hesitated, fiddling with her headset. "Oh, I think it's just for the rehearsal staging. Don't worry, everything's under control." It wasn't the words that bothered me. It was the practiced vagueness in her tone, the kind used when someone doesn't want to explain. I thought of my daughter's voice on the phone months ago. "It's the heart of the day, Mom." Now the phrase rang hollow, like a promise recited by memory, stripped of meaning. From where I stood, I could see her on the stage, a different veil draped over her hair as the photographer directed her to tilt her chin toward the light. This one was delicate, cathedral length, with a shimmer my hand-stitched lace didn't have. Hurt prickled at first, sharp and immediate, but beneath it another feeling stirred. Curiosity. If this wasn't about aesthetics, what was it about? Who had made the call to set mine aside? When the seating rehearsal began, the coordinator gestured for me to follow a line of relatives to their places. I expected to be near the aisle, perhaps in the second or third row. Instead, I was guided past rows of neatly tied bows and placed near the back, 3 seats from the aisle, with a clear view of the exit. As names were read aloud for the officiant's mock introductions, I braced for mine. He named the groom's parents, his step-parents, the bride's father, and moved on. My title never left his lips. I kept my face composed, my smile in place. A few guests glanced my way with that brand of sympathy people reserve for situations they're glad aren't theirs. I offered a polite nod, as if this arrangement had been my choice all along. Inside, I tucked away another mental note for future reference. My father's voice echoed in my head, an old American idiom he loved. "Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me." After the final run-through, as the crowd began to disperse, I felt a gentle tap on my elbow. A man I recognized vaguely from the engagement party, one of the groom's cousins, stood there. His expression carried that half-smile people wear when they're deciding how much truth to share. "Mind if I say something?" he murmured. I stepped aside with him, letting the chatter of the crowd mask our voices. "Look, I don't know you well, but just be aware, things have been said." I tilted my head. "Things?" He glanced toward the stage where the photographer was packing up. "About you. About where you fit into all this." His voice stayed low, careful. "I don't think this is the best place to get into it." But maybe later, if you want, we could talk. I studied him for a moment, weighing his intent. Concern or gossip, ally or troublemaker. He gave a small shrug. Just, don't let them box you out tomorrow. With that, he melted back into the crowd, leaving me with the distinct feeling that whatever had been whispered about me wasn't going to fade on its own. I gathered my things slowly, letting most of the others leave before I stepped toward the exit. That's when I caught sight of the fiancé near the stage, leaning toward the photographer. He gestured in my direction with a quick tilt of his chin, lips curling into a smirk I'd seen before. The kind that says the joke's on you and you don't even know the punchline yet. The photographer glanced over, then back to him. A moment later, she swiped her finger across her camera screen, tapped twice, and whatever had been there disappeared. It was such a small motion, easy to miss. But I didn't. And in that instant, I knew I wasn't imagining any of this. The historic Charleston Inn I'd chosen for my stay carried the kind of charm that tourists write home about. Tall windows framed with ivory drapes, creaking hardwood floors that told their own stories, and the faint perfume of magnolia drifting in through the balcony door. Warm lamplight softened the room's edges, making even the shadows seem gentle. I'd kicked off my shoes the moment I came in, my feet grateful after the long hours of the rehearsal. The veil rested on a padded hanger in the closet, layered carefully so the lace wouldn't snag. The wrapped gifts sat beside it, each tied with a satin bow I'd chosen to match my daughter's wedding palette. I'd made up my mind hours ago. Nothing would leave my possession until the ceremony itself. I sat at the small writing desk, flipping through the notes I'd scribbled during the day. Names of people who'd spoken to me, those who'd deliberately avoided my gaze, moments that felt staged. My pen hovered over the page before I closed the notebook. My late mother's words floated back. Sometimes the only card left to play is patience. Patience didn't mean silence, not entirely. I pulled out a plain ivory note card and began jotting down a few lines, just in case I was unexpectedly asked to speak tomorrow. It wasn't a speech, more a few heartfelt words I could stand on if the moment came. The air outside my room was cooler when I stepped out to get a cup of tea. The inn's hallways opened into a small lobby, beyond which an outdoor courtyard glowed under string lights. I passed by slowly, enjoying the quiet until a familiar voice sliced through the night. It was my daughter. Her tone, sharp, clipped, stopped me mid-step. "I just don't want her in the middle of everything," she was saying. The groom's voice followed. "Exactly. My parents shouldn't feel like they're playing second fiddle at our wedding." A woman laughed lightly. His mother. "Then we're agreed. Keep her out of the spotlight. It's cleaner that way." The words settled like ice water in my chest. Then my daughter again. "The veil? Use it for that funny shot you wanted with your groomsmen. She'll think it's an honor, but it'll be a joke for us." The groom chuckled. "Perfect. She won't even know." I stood in the shadow of a potted palm, pulse loud in my ears. Confusion bled into something colder, sharper. This wasn't thoughtlessness. It was a choice. I retraced my steps without a sound, careful not to draw attention. Back in my room, I locked the door and leaned against it for a long moment, letting the dark wrap around me. I wouldn't cry. Crying was like handing them a front-row seat to my pain. And I wasn't in the mood to sell tickets. Instead, I turned on the desk lamp, pulled my carry-on from under the bed, and began moving certain items into it. The veil went in first, folded in tissue and tucked deep between sweaters. The gift envelope followed. If they wanted to sideline me, they'd have to do it without what I'd brought. I checked the clock, just over 14 hours until the ceremony. 14 hours to decide exactly how I'd stand my ground. As I zipped a side pocket, a folded paper slid out of my purse and onto the floor. I picked it up, the rehearsal schedule from earlier. But on the back, in unfamiliar handwriting, were 4 words. "Ask her about the will." The looping letters belonged to the groom's cousin, the same one who'd pulled me aside after rehearsal. A slow, deliberate breath filled my lungs. How could his family possibly know anything about my estate? The question wasn't just about gossip anymore. It was about access, motives, and intentions. If they were willing to humiliate me publicly, what might they do privately? I crossed to the phone and dialed my lawyer's office, knowing it would go to voicemail at this hour. I kept my voice steady, concise. It's me. I'd like to confirm the protections we discussed are still in place. Call me first thing in the morning. No details over voicemail. Hanging up, I felt the quiet hum of resolve settle into my bones. Dignity was one thing. Protecting everything I'd worked for, that was another. I had just turned off the lamp when my phone lit up on the nightstand. An unknown number. Don't let them get that veil tomorrow. Trust me. No name. No punctuation beyond that. I sat there, phone in hand, heartbeat ticking louder than the clock on the wall. I didn't know if it was a warning or a threat, but I did know one thing. Whatever it was, I planned to act on it. The Charleston waterfront estate was every bit as grand as the brochures had promised. Tall white columns, balconies draped with flowering vines, and the slow shimmer of the harbor just beyond the manicured lawn. Guests strolled across the flagstone path in pastel dresses and pressed seersucker suits, the air thick with the sweetness of gardenias. I arrived with the veil in a discreet garment bag draped over my arm, my purse close against my side where the gift envelope rested. I had no illusions about what kind of welcome I'd receive, but part of me still hoped for basic civility. Near the entrance, an usher with an uncertain smile flipped through the seating chart on his clipboard. His brow furrowed. Huh, you're not on here for the ceremony. Maybe check at the reception? I'm the bride's mother, I said evenly. There must be a mistake. He gave me the kind of shrug reserved for problems too big to fix without permission. I'll find someone for you. But no one came. Another usher passed me off to a different coordinator, and she skimmed her own list before saying, maybe wait over there, near the garden. Over there meant away from the crowd, shaded by a hedge, like a misplaced guest waiting for her ride. I spotted the bridal party assembling near the veranda, a cluster of chiffon and hairspray. Laughter floated over, but it wasn't mine to share. A young woman with a headset intercepted me before I could approach. The photographer doesn't need you right now, she said briskly, her smile thin and unconvincing. I looked past her just in time to see my daughter's maid of honor hand the veil, my veil, to the groom's best man. He swung it over his shoulder like a scarf, and a few of the groomsmen grinned as if they were in on something. My daughter stood with the groom's mother, their heads tilted together, eyes bright with amusement. She didn't glance my way, though I knew she'd seen me. Around them, cousins and family friends shifted their gazes, avoiding the awkwardness of meeting mine. Humiliation prickled at the back of my neck, but I held my posture. If they wanted me to react, they'd be disappointed. I've learned that the most unnerving thing you can give someone who's trying to hurt you is nothing. Eventually, an usher guided me to a seat so far from the main aisle I could barely see the altar. A decorative trellis blocked part of my view, its vines heavy with blooms that smelled almost too sweet. The folding chair wobbled slightly when I sat down. Two women a few seats over whispered, not quietly enough. Isn't that the bride's mother? Why is she back here? I kept my eyes on the aisle. Let them speculate. Silence has a way of making people fill in the blanks themselves, and the stories they invent often reveal more than any truth I could offer. The music swelled, guests rose, and my daughter appeared on her father's arm. She looked radiant, but not in the way I had imagined seeing her on this day. The veil was nowhere in sight. I tracked every smile, every turn of her head, committing the absence to memory. Each slight, each calculated omission was a note in a ledger I intended to balance. When the ceremony ended and the recessional began, I stayed seated until the crowd thinned. Then I slipped quietly into the hallway that led to the reception area. The murmur of voices faded behind me. There, in an empty side room, I spotted it. The veil, draped carelessly over the back of a chair, its lace slightly wrinkled. I stepped inside, closing the door enough to block the view from the corridor. My fingers smoothed the fabric as I folded it, tucking it back into the garment bag. It belonged with me, not as a prop in someone's joke. In that moment, I felt a shift, small but certain. They thought they'd taken the power from me by excluding me, but all they'd really done was expose themselves. I pulled out my phone and sent a brief message to my lawyer. Confirm Monday meeting. We'll discuss details in person. No elaboration. Some things are better left unsaid until you're sitting across the table from someone you trust. I had almost reached the exit when a young server intercepted me. His tray balanced on one hand, he offered a neatly folded napkin with the other. "Someone asked me to give you this," he murmured, glancing over his shoulder before hurrying away. Inside the napkin was a scrap of stationery, the handwriting sharp and slanted. "You should see what they're saying about you at the reception table." I read it twice, then folded it back into the napkin and slipped it into my purse. I didn't need to go hear it. I already knew the shape of their words. But knowing didn't sting the way it might have yesterday. Instead, it solidified something. Whatever they thought they could say or do without consequence, they were about to learn otherwise. The ballroom gleamed under the weight of crystal chandeliers, each facet catching the light and scattering it like shards of ice across the polished marble floor. White floral arrangements towered at every table, roses and hydrangeas spilling over in a calculated display of wealth. The hum of conversation floated through the air, punctuated by the gentle clink of champagne flutes. A jazz trio played in the corner, the soft brush of drums blending with the sound of laughter. I stepped through the open doors, keeping my chin lifted, even as I sensed eyes sliding over me, and then away. The MC's voice rang out with theatrical enthusiasm, announcing the bridal party one by one. Names tumbled from his lips, bridesmaids, groomsmen, parents, until I realized the applause had died down and my name had never been spoken. No mistake, not here. I scanned the room, catching sight of the escort cards arranged on a mirrored table near the entrance. Mine was easy to find. It was the only one not tucked into the ornate display with the others. Instead, it lay apart, off to the side, its edges curling slightly, my name printed in smaller type. The table number read 23. My eyes flicked to the far corner of the room where a few tables were crammed against the wall near the service entrance. The deliberate intent was as plain as the polished floor beneath my feet. I felt my mouth curve into a polite smile I didn't feel. If they were expecting me to protest, they'd be disappointed again. Still, I walked toward the main family table, weaving between chairs draped in white satin. Maybe, just maybe, someone had misplaced the card. The head table was a vision of symmetry. Gold-rimmed china, crystal stemware, place cards neatly aligned. My daughter sat between the groom and his mother, her head thrown back in laughter at something the best man had said. Before I could take a step closer, the maid of honor materialized in front of me, blocking my view. Her smile was too sweet to be genuine. "Oh, this table's full," she said in a tone meant to sound regretful. "But you've got a lovely spot near the back. Nice and quiet." "Quiet," I repeated, letting the word rest between us, heavier than it should have been. She tilted her head, waiting for me to step aside. Around us, guests pretended to be caught up in conversation, though I felt the weight of their glances. I turned without a word and made my way to table 23. My seat was between a cousin I hadn't seen in 20 years and a man from the groom's side I didn't recognize. He nodded politely before turning back to his phone. My cousin offered a thin smile. "Well, this is cozy." I returned the smile but didn't reply. Instead, I listened. It didn't take long to hear snippets of gossip drifting from the nearby table. Quiet, but not so quiet they couldn't be overheard. My name surfaced twice, paired with words like, "surprised she even came," and "must be awkward for her." Each sentence stitched the truth tighter. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a coordinated snub. The band shifted to a softer tune as the groom's father rose, champagne flute in hand. He cleared his throat, drawing the room's attention. "Let's raise our glasses to the women who raised this fine young bride," he said warmly, his gaze landing squarely on the groom's mother. Murmurs rippled through the room. I felt more than saw the sideways glances sent my way. My daughter didn't correct him. She smiled, lifted her glass, and clinked it against her mother-in-law's. I raised my own glass slowly, holding my daughter's gaze from across the room. My smile didn't reach my eyes. This is the last toast they'll make without paying for it, I thought. I took a small sip, tasting nothing, filing the moment away with every other insult they'd handed me today. As the servers began clearing plates, I noticed movement at my side. It was the same young server from the ceremony, the one who'd slipped me a note earlier. His expression was careful, as if he knew he was being watched. Passing behind me, he placed a folded piece of paper on my bread plate without a word. I waited until the servers moved on before opening it. The handwriting was hurried but clear. "They're mocking your gift. Be careful what you leave behind." I followed the direction of my instincts and glanced toward the head table. My daughter was leaning over an opened box, the one I'd wrapped myself, the ribbon now discarded. She said something to the groom's mother, and they both laughed, her hand covering her mouth in mock discretion. A flicker of rage rose in me, sharp and clean, but right behind it came a wave of clarity. Confronting them here would only feed their story. Instead, I folded the note, slid it into my purse alongside the envelope of legal documents I'd carried from home, and smoothed my napkin back over the plate. The band struck up a livelier tune, something meant to pull everyone onto the dance floor. Guests rose in pairs, dresses swishing, shoes clicking on the marble. I remained seated until the first surge of bodies had moved past. Then I stood, careful to keep my movements unhurried. No one at my table tried to stop me. No one even asked where I was going. I stepped toward the side exit, the air cooling as I slipped through the open doorway into the quieter hallway beyond. The music and laughter dimmed behind me. They thought I was leaving because I'd been beaten, but I hadn't walked away to surrender. I'd walked away to set the next move in motion, the one they'd never see coming. I slipped through the side door without looking back, letting the cool draft of the hallway wash over me. The sound of clinking glasses and forced laughter dulled into a faint hum, trapped behind the heavy double doors. My heels clicked against the marble as I wove through the hotel's quieter corridors, each wall lined with framed photographs of past events, smiling brides, proud families, moments preserved for people who clearly belonged. I slowed my pace, my fingertips brushing against the polished wooden chair rail as if grounding myself. Around the corner, a faint scent of rosemary and seared meat drifted from the catering prep area. The hall widened into a small alcove where a few banquet staff hurried past, balancing trays stacked with untouched hors d'oeuvres. Shrimp skewers, mini quiches, smoked salmon blinis, all heading back to the kitchen, still pristine. Waste, I thought. Just like my daughter's choices today. Lavish but hollow, built to impress, not to last. I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes, drawing in a long breath. The folded note the young server had given me replayed in my mind. "They're mocking your gift." It wasn't just a jab, it was a confirmation. Every little slight today had been intentional, orchestrated. My seat near the service entrance, my name missing from the announcements. And now this, the heirloom veil and carefully chosen gift turned into a punchline. A shuffle of footsteps made me open my eyes. The young server was there, standing a few feet away, as if unsure whether to approach. When our eyes met, he stepped closer, keeping his voice low. "I wasn't sure you'd come out here," he said. "I didn't mean to make things harder for you earlier." "You didn't," I replied evenly. "You told me the truth. Most people wouldn't bother." He glanced around to make sure no one was near. "I overheard her," he said quietly. "The bride." "She was talking to one of the bridesmaids, said something about your gift being so old-fashioned it should be in a thrift store. Then they laughed and guessed how much you'd spent. They all agreed it wasn't much." The words landed with a dull thud inside me, not because I believed them, but because I knew she had no shame in saying them out loud. And it's not just you, he added. During the rehearsal dinner, she made jokes about the kitchen staff. The planner told me not to take it personally, but he trailed off, shrugging. You can only hear that kind of thing so many times before it sticks. I studied him for a moment. He couldn't have been older than 22, yet there was a tiredness in his eyes I recognized. You've been on the receiving end too, I said. He nodded. More than once. That's why I wanted to warn you. I can help you get your things before they, you know. Before they decide to rehome them? I said dryly. His lips twitched into the ghost of a smile. Something like that. Follow me. I'll keep you out of sight. We moved quickly but quietly through the service hallway, passing stacks of folded linens and rolling racks of empty glassware. He stopped in front of a small, unmarked door and pulled a key from his pocket. This is where they're keeping the gifts until the hotel staff loads them into the van, he explained. Most people don't know it's here. The lock clicked, and he pushed the door open. A faint scent of cardboard and fresh flowers met me. The room was dim, lit by a single overhead bulb. Piles of wrapped boxes and gift bags covered 2 folding tables and spilled onto the floor. And there it was, my heirloom veil. Tossed carelessly on top of a stack of unopened boxes, the lace crumpled, its ivory fabric dulled under the harsh light. I stepped closer, my throat tightening. This veil had been worn by 3 generations of women in my family. I'd carried it here in its own protective bag. Now it looked as if it had been handled like an afterthought. Next to it sat a gift bag with my handwriting on the tag. A bright pink sticky note was slapped across the front, its inked words neat and sharp. Garage sale. I didn't gasp. I didn't let my hands shake. Instead, I pulled my phone from my purse and began taking photographs. Wide shots, close-ups, even one with the sticky note in clear focus. The sound of the shutter was loud in the quiet room, but I didn't care. When I finished, I turned to him. Thank you, I said softly. You didn't have to risk this. He shrugged. Some people are worth the risk. I carefully lifted the veil and the gift bag, placing both into the large tote I'd brought with me. The zipper closed with a clean sweep, sealing them inside. Every motion felt deliberate, controlled. I'm leaving, I said, more to myself than to him. He tilted his head. You're not going to say anything? Not tonight, I replied. They think this is over. They'll think I left because I couldn't take it. Let them. As I walked toward the door, I thought of something my mother used to say whenever she sensed trouble brewing. Never start a war you can't finish, but never lose one you start. Tonight I had no intention of losing. We stepped back into the hallway. The hum of music and laughter was still there, faint but steady. I didn't slow as we neared the side exit. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped outside, carrying with it the faint scent of rain on asphalt. My car sat under the glow of a nearby street lamp. I reached it without glancing over my shoulder, but once my hand was on the door handle, I turned. The hotel's reception hall windows glowed like a beacon, shadows of dancers moving behind the sheer curtains. They believed their insults were locked away in a back room. They had no idea I intended to put that room, and everything inside it, under a much brighter light. They thought their whispers would vanish with the night. I planned to make sure their words had a much longer life. Morning light cut through the slats of the blinds in my small hotel room, streaking across the bedspread in pale gold. The air had that crisp, after-the-storm stillness, though the only storm had been the one I'd walked away from last night. My coffee maker gurgled in the corner, sending up the bitter, comforting scent I relied on to start the day. I cleared the small round table by the window and began laying things out with care, as though I were setting up an evidence board. First, the heirloom veil, its delicate lace still smelling faintly of lavender from my cedar chest. Then, the gift bag, crumpled now but intact. And finally, the photos I'd taken in that back room. The sticky note with garage sale scrawled across it stared back at me like a dare. I pulled my notepad closer, jotting down a list. Organize files, backup images to my cloud, find legal angle, decide who to send copies to. My hands were steady. I refused to act on anger alone. Emotion could cloud judgment, and right now I needed a clear head. A glance at my phone revealed several missed calls from unfamiliar numbers, probably reception guests who'd decided my early departure was the juiciest story of the night. I deleted the voicemails without listening. That kind of noise didn't deserve space in my day. I was halfway through my second sip of coffee when a knock at the door startled me. Sharp, quick, someone with urgency. I opened it to find the young server from last night standing there, a little out of breath, clutching a plain white envelope. "I hope I'm not waking you," he said, eyes darting down the hallway as if to make sure no one saw him. "Come in," I replied, stepping aside. "You look like you've been running." He offered a small, tense smile and handed me the envelope. "You should see this before anyone else does." Inside, I found a printed screenshot of a group chat, names I didn't recognize, but messages I could read plain as day. "Did you see that veil? Looks like something from a thrift store. I can't believe she thinks that counts as a gift. Let's just misplace it before the ceremony. Problem solved." Each line felt like a slap, not because it was new, but because it confirmed what I'd suspected for months, that this wasn't accidental distance, it was deliberate exclusion. "The head bartender saw them passing the phone around last night," the server explained. "One of the catering staff screenshotted it before they deleted it. Thought you might want it." I took a slow breath. "That's more helpful than you know." "They've been like this with others too," he added quietly. "I've seen them mock people, mess with seating charts during rehearsals, small things to make someone feel unwanted. I didn't think it was my place to step in, but last night, that was different." I met his gaze. "It's always your place to stand up for someone being pushed aside. You did the right thing." He nodded, looking almost relieved. "I figured you might want all the proof you can get before—" He trailed off, as if he didn't want to assume what I might do. "You figured right," I said, folding the printout and setting it neatly beside the photos. "And you've given me something I didn't have before. A trail." After he left, I sat for a moment in the quiet, the envelope still warm from his hands. My mind immediately went to Helen. Helen and I had been friends since our 30s, back when life was still more about plans than regrets. She'd spent decades as a lawyer before retiring to a lake house 2 states away, and if there was anyone who could help me think 10 steps ahead, it was her. When she answered, her voice was still husky from sleep. "You're calling early. What happened?" I told her everything, about the veil, the photos, the sticky note, and now the screenshots. She listened without interrupting, the way only someone who's been trained to hear both the facts and the silences between them can. When I finished, she said, "You're sitting on more leverage than you think, but don't spend it yet. First rule, secure every piece of evidence in at least 3 places. Screenshots, originals, backups." "I've got 2 already," I replied. "I'll make it 3 before the morning's out." "Good. Second rule, don't let them know what you have. Let them believe you walked away hurt, not armed. When people think you're powerless, they get sloppy." I smiled despite myself. "You always did know how to make patience sound like a weapon." "That's because it is," she said. "Power isn't about shouting louder. It's about knowing when to speak and when to let others panic." We went over possible angles, how the screenshots could reveal defamation, how the mishandling of my property might fall under a different legal category. But Helen knew I wasn't chasing court dates. I was protecting myself from whatever they thought they could do next. When we hung up, I felt steadier, my path clearer. This wasn't going to be about public scenes or emotional confrontations. This was going to be about timing. I picked up my phone and typed a short message to my daughter. "I have something of yours. We should talk." The reply didn't come until hours later. Just one line. "Whatever it is, I'm sure it's not important. Dismissive, cold, the exact tone I'd been expecting. I let the phone rest on the table, the corners of my mouth lifting. The longer they underestimated me, the better my position became. By mid-afternoon, I had decided on my next move. I pulled out a fresh sheet of stationery, not for her, but for someone else in the family who had influence she didn't see coming. Someone who'd once told me, "If you ever need me to put a stop to something, I will." I began the letter carefully, each word measured, avoiding anything that could be spun as spite. Facts only, but laid out in a way that made the pattern unmistakable. Midway through, I slipped one of the photos into the envelope, the veil, limp and discarded atop a pile of unopened boxes. When I sealed the flap, I pressed it flat with the side of my hand, the way my mother used to. A small ritual, but one that carried a sense of finality. I set it on the table beside the coffee mug, now cold and half empty, and looked out the window. The sun had shifted, throwing the room into a softer light. By the time they opened this, the game wouldn't just have changed, they'd realize I'd been holding the rulebook all along. The air that morning had the kind of stillness you only notice when you're carrying something that matters. I left the hotel early, the sealed envelope pressed between my fingers like it was holding my pulse in place. The streets of the small town were half asleep, just a few shopkeepers unlocking their doors, the smell of bread drifting from the bakery, a lone dog trotting past. Every step toward the post office felt deliberate, measured. I told myself I was just running an errand, but in truth, this was a move I'd been lining up for days. The plan was simple: send the letter to a family member who still had a voice that couldn't be ignored. The right set of eyes would turn my quiet evidence into something undeniable. When I stepped into the post office, the bell above the door gave its little chime. Marlene, the postmaster, greeted me like she always did, with a smile that said she'd known me for years even though this was only my second time in there. We exchanged the usual small talk about the weather and how the azaleas were blooming early this year. I slid the envelope across the counter, watching her weigh it and stamp it with the calm precision of someone who doesn't realize the paper in her hands could turn a family gathering into a war zone. The moment she took it from me, I felt a strange, almost ceremonial release, like I'd just set a stone rolling downhill. By the time I stepped back out into the sunlight, I was steady. The piece was in play. All I had to do was wait. That calm lasted until mid-afternoon. My phone rang, Helen's name flashing across the screen. I answered, already sensing something had gone sideways. "Don't panic," she began. Never a good opener. "But your letter didn't make it where you thought it would." I stopped in my tracks. "What do you mean it didn't make it?" She explained quickly. The niece of the groom, barely 20, the kind of girl who collects secrets the way other people collect shoes, worked at the very office where my intended recipient got his mail. She'd spotted my handwriting immediately. Helen's voice dropped. She opened it, took pictures of everything inside before passing it on. And Marjorie, she's already shared some of it with the wrong people. My grip tightened around the phone. Define wrong people. Let's just say there's a group chat buzzing right now, and your daughter's name is all over it. I closed my eyes for a moment, the image forming too easily. The veil photo, the notes, the proof I'd been keeping close, now passed around like gossip over coffee. I'd planned for control, for timing. This was neither, but Helen wasn't finished. "The leak is partial. They don't have the whole story, just enough to make them nervous." Nervous. That was something. By evening, the ripple had reached me in indirect ways. A couple of mutual acquaintances texted out of the blue, each message dressed up as casual check-ins but edged with curiosity. "Hey, how's your trip going? Heard you've been busy." And then there was the sudden silence from people who, just yesterday, had no trouble asking for my room number. Scrolling through my phone, I caught vague social media posts, cryptic captions about truth always coming out and some people can't help themselves. Half defensive, half accusatory. The bride's circle was on alert. I set the phone down, leaning back in the stiff hotel chair. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd been ready to pull the curtain back when it suited me, but now the fabric was being yanked from the other side. Helen called again that night. "This may push things forward faster than you wanted," she said. "Can you adjust?" I looked at the veil draped across the dresser, its lace catching the lamplight. "I can," I told her, "but it means shifting the endgame." The next morning, instead of chasing the noise, I stepped back. Let them spin their theories. Let them wonder who else knew what. There's power in watching the fire spread without rushing in with a bucket. From my quiet spot at a cafe across from the courthouse, I watched people move in and out, some glancing my way, some avoiding my eyes entirely. You learn a lot about loyalties when rumors start to settle like dust. I kept a small notebook open beside my coffee cup, jotting down names, small behaviors, even the pauses between sentences when people spoke to me. It wasn't paranoia. It was keeping score. A man I recognized from the reception, someone who'd been seated near the groom's parents, stopped at my table. "Strange week," he said with a knowing look. "Strange how?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "Just people talking more than they should." He shrugged and moved on, but it was enough to confirm my suspicion. The wildfire was burning exactly where I needed a clearing. Helen's words from yesterday stuck with me. Sometimes the wildfire burns exactly where you needed the clearing. By the time the sun dipped low, the town was quieter again. I returned to the hotel, deciding I'd earned a night without thinking about the next move. But as I set my phone down on the nightstand, it buzzed with a new message from an unknown number. No words at first, just a photo. My letter unfolded on a kitchen counter next to a half-empty glass of wine. The edge of a woman's hand in the corner of the frame, nails painted deep red. Then the text came through. "We should talk. Tomorrow. Alone." I stared at it, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. For months I'd been moving my pieces across the board. Now, someone else had just made a move I never saw coming. The text from last night still sat at the top of my messages, taunting me with its brevity. "We should talk. Tomorrow. Alone." I had spent half the night turning it over in my mind, matching it to possible senders, eliminating and then reconsidering names until sleep finally forced my eyes closed. When morning came, I decided if I was going to walk into someone else's game, I'd choose the field. There was a cafe 2 streets over from the courthouse, small enough for a private conversation, but open enough to avoid feeling cornered. The regulars there were mostly retirees and the occasional lawyer on break. Neutral ground. I arrived 20 minutes early, choosing a corner table that gave me a full view of the front door and the large plate glass window facing Main Street. Outside, the town moved at its usual sleepy rhythm. A pair of men arguing amiably about baseball over the hood of a pickup, the postman taking his time at each mailbox, the traffic light cycling lazily from green to red without urgency. It was the kind of backdrop that could fool anyone into lowering their guard. I didn't. I ordered a black coffee, wrapping my hands around the warm cup, and mentally rehearsed the possible directions this conversation could go. From civil exchange to verbal ambush. In situations like this, the environment mattered as much as the words. By sitting with my back to the wall, eyes on the door, I had control over at least one variable. At precisely 10:03, the door swung open. My grip on the coffee tightened slightly, and then loosened when I saw that the person entering was not the one I expected. She was a woman in her late 40s, maybe early 50s, with hair cut in a sharp bob and a pair of sunglasses she slid off slowly, like she was giving me time to study her face. She walked straight toward my table without hesitation. "You're not who I was expecting," I said evenly. "I could say the same," she replied, sliding into the chair opposite me before I could offer or refuse. She placed a small leather purse on the table, folded her hands over it, and leaned forward slightly. "I'm just someone who hates wasted potential." Cryptic, deliberate. Her tone carried the kind of confidence that didn't need to raise its voice. She told me she'd heard about my letter. Not from the person who sent the text, but through a completely different chain. "Small towns," she said, almost amused. "You can whisper into one corner and someone in the opposite corner hears the echo." As she spoke, she dropped carefully chosen tidbits about what the bride's friends were saying. Fragments, not the whole picture. It was enough to unsettle without providing confirmation of anything. "You're being selective," I observed. "I'm being careful," she corrected, smiling faintly. "There's a difference." I sipped my coffee, keeping my eyes on her. This was a woman who knew how to control a narrative, but I had learned long ago that control could be tested. "I appreciate the update," I said, "but you'll understand if I don't put all my cards on the table." I'd expect nothing less. Her gaze didn't waver. I decided to test her. I slipped a harmless, fabricated detail into the conversation. Something small but traceable. "Interesting," she murmured, giving nothing away. If she passed that detail along and it found its way back to me, I'd know exactly where the leak started. For the next 20 minutes, we fenced with words that looked polite but carried edges underneath. Finally, she glanced at her watch and stood. "You'll be hearing about me again," she said. "That a promise or a threat?" I asked. "That depends on how you play your hand." She left without looking back. I sat for a moment longer, finishing my coffee, then stepped out into the late morning sun. The air was heavier now, the kind that clung to your skin and made you aware of every step. Walking home, I replayed each line, each pause, each tilt of her head. She was a card in the deck. I just didn't know yet whether she was worth playing. Once home, I called Helen. "Met someone unexpected today," I told her, summarizing the conversation. "Friend or foe?" Helen asked. "Neither." "Yet, a wild card," I replied. "But it means the circle just got bigger and messier." Helen exhaled slowly. "Then maybe you should make the circle smaller on your end." I agreed. From now on, fewer people would know the actual timeline or the full scope of my plan. The stranger's name went at the bottom of my scorecard list, a neat question mark beside it. By the time the sun dipped behind the trees, I'd managed to set the day aside, or so I thought. I was getting ready for bed when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. A new message lit up the screen. "Next time, pick somewhere with better coffee." No name, no emoji, just the sentence. I scrolled back through my contacts. The number matched neither the person I'd met today nor the original texter from last night. I set the phone down slowly, my reflection staring back at me in the darkened screen. For the first time since this all began, I wasn't entirely sure if I was the hunter or the bait. I woke before the first hint of sunrise, my bedroom still cloaked in that heavy pre-dawn silence where the world feels suspended. The air was cool, and for the first time in weeks, my head was clear. No replaying arguments, no gnawing uncertainty, just a calm, focused readiness. On the kitchen table, my arsenal waited, neatly stacked documents, bank statements, receipts, signed agreements, every piece of proof I'd gathered, each one a loaded bullet in the chamber. I ran my hand over the top sheet, not out of sentiment but to feel the solidity of it, the weight of what I'd earned. I dressed in a tailored navy suit, no frills, no bright colors. I wasn't here to impress or blend in. I was here to close a chapter. As I buttoned my jacket, I repeated the words I'd been telling myself for days. This is not revenge. This is correction. By 7:30, I was in my car, heading toward the wedding venue. The roads were nearly empty, save for a few delivery trucks and a jogger with a reflective vest. My fingers rested lightly on the steering wheel, but my mind was steel. When I arrived, the parking lot was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before chaos. The manager, a man in his 40s with a quick smile that didn't reach his eyes, met me at the front doors. I'm here to make a few adjustments before the event, I said, handing over the property authorization forms. He scanned the papers, glanced at me, and then back at the signatures. Well, this certainly gives you the right. We walked through the ballroom together. I pointed to the floral arches, the crystal centerpieces, the champagne towers. Remove them. Replace with standard arrangements. He hesitated. These were part of the package I paid for, I finished. And I'm retracting that part of the payment. Today, right now. Within minutes, the staff was in motion. The towering arrangements were carried out, replaced with simple glass vases holding 3 white carnations each. The catering team was instructed to revert to the basic menu. No premium cuts, no imported cheese platters. The plush velvet chairs were swapped for standard folding ones. The event coordinator, a young woman with a headset, approached me nervously. They're going to notice. That's the point, I said. If they want the extras back, they can pay for them in full before the first guest sits down. In cash. By the time the first curious relatives began drifting in, whispers had already started. A few of them glanced my way, others avoided my eyes entirely. When the last of the guests had arrived and the couple was posing for their grand entrance photos, I stepped into the center of the reception hall. My heels clicked against the polished floor, each step deliberate. "Excuse me," I said, loud enough to still the chatter. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the photographer lowered his camera. "Some of you think you know the story," I began, my voice steady. "You've heard whispers, maybe even chosen sides. Let me correct a few details." I told them about paying for my own ticket to fly here, about bringing the heirloom veil, the gifts, everything without so much as a thank you, about the small, calculated humiliations, the way they made sure I felt like an outsider at every step. Faces shifted in the crowd. A few people looked away. Others leaned forward. Then I pulled a single envelope from my bag and held it up. "This," I said, "is a notice that effective today, I've revoked all financial commitments previously made to the couple." A murmur rippled through the room. "And because I don't believe in letting good money go to waste," I continued, "the amount I had set aside for their future is being donated, in their names, to a veterans housing program, one that helps people who actually understand loyalty and respect." I turned to face the bride and groom directly. Her smile had frozen. His jaw was tight. "You wanted to show me I wasn't family. Consider the feeling mutual." Silence. Then someone near the back let out a quiet, "Wow." I didn't linger to see how they'd recover. I walked toward the exit, the sound of shifting feet and whispered speculation trailing behind me. The midday sun met me at the door, bright and warm, almost jarring after the cool air inside. With each step across the parking lot, I felt the weight lift. Not all at once, but in layers, like peeling off something I'd been carrying far too long. I didn't need to witness the fallout to know it would sting. Power wasn't in the spectacle. It was in choosing the moment to let go. By the time I reached my car, a small smile had formed. They'd remember this day, just not for the reasons they planned. That evening, back home, I was halfway through making tea when my phone buzzed. A voicemail notification. I pressed play. "Nicely done," the voice said, the same woman from the cafe. "Now, about our next move." I stood there, tea bag dangling from my hand, the corners of my mouth lifting again. Turns out the wedding was just the opening act.